Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. It feels like a lifetime since we've had one of these. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Hans-Johann Glock from the University of Zurich. He works, among other things, on Wittgenstein, Quine-Davidson, analytic philosophy in general. But lately he's been working on animals. I think he's writing a book on animals, but one has somehow already come out in Spanish, so you get translated before you write it, which is pretty impressive.
That's very good, isn't it?
And so he'll tell us why they matter. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for coming here. It's quite a challenge to get people into this room, passing by all the splendors of the Ashmolean Museum, I reckon. But if you want to do it, I think animals is the topic. Now I'm going to use PowerPoint after a few moments of fright, and I have begun to think that all power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So, why animals matter? Now, I have a problem. Namely, I'm reasonably well known, so enough to get invited, but I'm not famous enough to simply hold forth on what has recently occupied me. So I always do these talks to specifications. So I am going to talk about why animals matter. I'm not going to say that much about some of the issues raised. So, it's mainly about clarifying questions that concern animals and their importance for philosophy, for science, for morality. Now, normally just clarifying issues is helpful but can be very tedious. But I've discovered when I talk about animals, no matter how tedious my talk, no matter how modest my claims, someone or other in the audience gets terribly irritated. And so I hold no fear that, this is going to, just be acceptable to everyone or even anyone. Okay, so the preview. I'll first, introduce my brief, and I will also actually already give a short answer to the question, why do animals matter? And then, I'll tell you that they matter because they raise three problems: an anthropological problem, sort of who are we, an ethical problem of animal welfare, and a psychological problem of animal minds. And then in the sequel, I shall try to shed light on the importance of animals by clarifying the connection between these three questions. So the first question is the anthropological question and the quest for what one might call the anthropological difference, the feature, if any, that sets us apart from non-human animals. And then I will talk about the connection between the issue of the anthropological difference and the issue of animal minds. Are the properties which set humans apart really exclusively our mental capacities, or do other features play a role, in particular our possession of a hand? Then I will talk about the connection between the anthropological difference and issues of animal welfare, issues of how we should treat animals. And then I shall talk about the connection between animal minds and animal welfare. Does the question of how we should treat animals depend exclusively on their mental capacities, if any? And then finally, I shall say a bit about why philosophy matters. Many of the things I'm going to talk about won't be exclusively philosophical, although I shall approach them from a philosophical perspective, I hope. Okay, so, introduction. So, when I speak of animals in the sequel, I mean non-human animals. We humans are also animals, but I'm talking about non-human animals, and they have played a role within Western thought at least since antiquity. And it seems that the reason for this is the felt urgency of three problems. The first is an ethical problem of how we should treat animals, the problem of our obligations towards animals. I call that the topic of animal welfare. The second problem is the anthropological problem of whether there are fundamental differences between us and animals. And I call these differences, the differences, if they exist, I call that the anthropological difference. Or the human-animal difference, if you wish. And finally, there's the psychological problem of whether some animals have mental capacities or, mental capacities that in any way are comparable to the capacities of human beings. And that is the topic of animal minds. And as indicated, my aim is to shed light on the importance of animals by clarifying the relations between these problems. Okay, so now, first the quest for the anthropological difference. So for anthropology, the study of human beings, animals are absolutely central because they serve as an object of comparison. Now, we used to compare ourselves with God, looking upstairs, and animals looking downstairs. God is a rather fishy object of comparison for several reasons. So, animals really remain, if we want to sort of place ourselves within the natural order. So, animals are objects of comparison. So here's a quote from de Condillac. "It would be of little interest to know what animals are if it weren't a means for knowing what we are." And one of the most eminent 20th century anthropologists said, "Any philosophy must define the essential difference between humans and animals." Okay, so now what precisely are we looking for when we look for this difference? Well, we should remind ourselves that anthropology, really the study of the nature of human beings, has two central topics. One is the topic of anthropological constants or universals. And that's the question of whether there are features that are shared by all human beings, irrespective of their social or cultural or historical context. Now, are there any properties which all humans or all normal humans possess? So, and those properties, if they exist, would be anthropological constants or universals. And the other, equally central problem is the problem of the human-animal or anthropological difference. Are there features that are unique to humans, i.e. set all of them apart from all non-human animals? Are there any features that only we possess but no non-human animal possesses? But now, this is a lesson which doesn't go down well usually with a British or Swiss audience, who all feel very special, and not just very special, but very, very special. But they need to be reminded that there's nothing special about being special. Right? There's nothing special about being unique. And that holds for species as well. Every biological species differs from all the others, i.e. it has some unique features. Now, there's an empirical reason why that is the case, because speciation, the formation of different species in evolution, proceeds by specialization. It proceeds by the more and more refined exploitation of an ecological niche. And so that means that, the evolution forms a tree, and, the branches grow ever wider apart. And so, every species is, differs from the others through some features. So, for instance, only certain bacteria perform chemosynthesis. Only bats can navigate through ultrasound. Among mammals, at least, only beavers can digest wood. And it isn't very difficult to find features that set humans apart in this way. As the German humorist Loriot once remarked, "Man is the only creature that can partake of a hot meal in flight." Okay. And, that's correct. Don't try to be clever. I've heard, counter-examples, but I warn you, I'm prepared. So anyway, so that's correct. Only man can partake of a hot meal in flight. But, that's not really what we're interested in when we are looking for, the anthropological difference. We are really looking for a difference with a difference. We are looking for features of Homo sapiens that I think are supposed to satisfy at least 3 conditions. They should set us apart categorically or essentially or qualitatively from all other animals. It shouldn't be a matter of us just being more intelligent than they are. It should be a matter, for instance, of us being rational and they not. And they should be fundamental, these differences, or the anthropological difference, they should be fundamental in that all other important differences derive from this anthropological difference. And that's, I think, where the distinguishing feature pointed out by Loriot fails, because our capacity to partake of hot meals in flight is derivative of our technological capacities. And finally, these features should be important to our self-image, to our self-understanding, to who we think we are. Now, these 3 features connect this search for an anthropological difference not just with the question of animal minds, but also with moral issues in general, and with animal welfare in particular, also I shall argue. Now, in order to, develop that case, I need to have a look at a few candidates for an anthropological difference. I mean, through the ages, various features have been, so to speak, fingered for constituting an anthropological difference. There are problems with virtually all of them, but that's not really my topic. I just want to give you a list, and because that's important in order to see how this search for the human-animal divide is connected with animal welfare and animal minds. So in very rough chronological order, you might think that we are distinct because we have the capacity for thought, intelligence, reason. We have a moral sense, a capacity for moral judgments. Animals are supposed to lack it. We have free will or autonomy. We can decide to do things, whereas animals are just driven by stimuli. We have self-consciousness. We can't just observe the environment, we're also conscious of ourselves. We have an immortal soul. That's a suggestion. Well, I mean, not that much more ridiculous than some of the others, but anyway. We are supposed to be distinct by dint of tool use or tool manufacture. Language is supposed to distinguish us from all animals. A sense of the past and future is supposed to be unique to us. And the most recent suggestion, culture or cultural development, is supposed to be unique to human beings. Okay, now if you look at that list, and this by no means complete, then that provides a foil for talking about the connection between the anthropological difference and animal minds. Most items on this list concern properties that are loosely speaking mental, self-consciousness or intelligence, etc. So mental properties, mental capacities. And the dominant view, going back to Aristotle, is indeed that what sets us apart is either exclusively or at least primarily certain advanced mental, cognitive or volitional capacities, and by a fashionable implication today, certain neural structures which underlie these mental capacities. So here's a quote from Peter Hacker. The abilities distinctive of human beings are abilities of intellect and will. So clearly mental. There is, however, that's the majority view, there is, however, a minority view according to which the anthropological difference consists also, or even perhaps primarily, of morphological or anatomical or functional peculiarities that we have. So, it's not all in the head, it's not all in the brain, it's not all in the mind, but it concerns also our body, and it's either physiological or anatomical or functional peculiarities. Now, the two peculiarities that have been proposed here is, on the one hand, bipedalism, we walk upright, on the one hand, and the special manipulative prowess, the dexterity and precision of our hands. I use the term "our" here, with some, with a certain hesitation, because I'm about as clumsy as they come. But anyway, I'm speaking on your behalf. Okay, so there's numerous types. I'm ever so sorry. What about the connection between bipedalism and manual prowess? Now, I think it's generally acknowledged that bipedality is a pre or enabling condition of the evolutionary increase in manual dexterity and precision. Why? It's very simple. In order to make use of hands, however, fine and dexterous they may be, you have to, you mustn't use your hands to just, crawl along the ground. So, the hands must be freed in order to be able to perform all these wonderful manual tasks. So bipedalism is, if you wish, a precondition for the increase in manual dexterity. But nevertheless, I think it's plausible that, it is the manual dexterity which is the immediate cause of the growth of human intelligence and of human technology. Right? We don't really advance our technology immediately, or our tools, through walking or running. I'm saying this with some hesitation, because Emil Zatopek, the great long-distance runner, once said, "Fish swim, birds fly, humans run." And, as a runner, I feel strong sympathies for this, but ultimately I do think, if you ask yourself what sets us apart, I think the hands are a better bet than our feet, so to speak. And here just... Steven Pinker sums up recent findings in paleontology. Precision tools and precision intelligence co-evolved in the human lineage, and the fossil record showed that the hand led the way. So the hand is leading the way in the development of tools and the intelligence which goes along with it. At least that's what the fossil record suggests. Okay, so now, it's not the feet, it's higher up, it's the hands. What about the suggestion that it's the hands, or rather the capacity for manipulation, handiness, which constitutes the anthropological difference? Now, that view, I will summarize, I'll call that the handiness thesis. It's our hands that set us apart. And that handiness thesis is closely connected with what you might call the Homo faber thesis, the much older thesis that humans should be defined as tool-using and tool-making animals. If you remember, that occurred on our list of potential unique features. That's a suggestion that was made, among others, by Benjamin Franklin, by Babbage, and by Karl Marx, who, after 2008, can be quoted again. So here is Marx. One can distinguish humans from animals by reference to consciousness, religion, what have you. Humans themselves start to distinguish themselves as soon as they begin to produce their food, as soon as they start working manually. So the idea is that it's the specifically human competence for actively transforming our ecological niche in an intentional and rational way, mainly through the use of tools, which is what Marx means by work. Now, this thesis doesn't just have a relatively respectable pedigree. It has also been recently defended by Raymond Tallis, who I take it
was here.
Oh, well, shame he can't take me apart here. Anyway, so Tallis emphasizes the role of manual prowess in the emergence of Homo sapiens. And he also stands out as an unabashed advocate of human exceptionalism. He regards it, unlike many contemporary thinkers, he regards it as obvious that there is a fundamental gap separating us from beasts. Far from being under-recognized, our proximity to other animals has been exaggerated. Our roots are not our leaves. And he immediately connects that to the hand. Through the hand, human culture waves away or goodbye to animal nature. Now, how plausible is this idea that it's handiness that sets us apart? Well, actually, I'll let you off on grounds of good behavior. So, how plausible is the idea that it's handiness, the dexterity of hands, which constitutes the crucial difference? Well, in order to clarify that issue, we have to look at the connection between handiness and tools. The handiness thesis presupposes the homo faber thesis, and hence presupposes that tools are the preserve of humans, right? I mean, being clever with certain limbs is not something that is unique to humans, but using them for tools and for the production of tools, that may be unique to humans. But it seems to me there's clear evidence that neither tool use nor tool production is unique to humans. There's empirical evidence. I mean, tool use has been observed among many animals, but tool production was observed in the first instance by Jane Goodall. She saw a chimpanzee fetching breaking off branches from bushes and strip the branches of their leaves and then use them to fish for termites. They stick them into termite mounds, and then the termites crawl up and then this is a chimpanzee lollipop. Okay, so when she first observed this, she reported her discovery to her mentor, Louis Leakey, and Louis Leakey in response famously remarked, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans." Right? Well, those are the three options. Now, in my view, only the second option is very palatable. Yeah. Unfortunately, Tallis opts for number one. Tallis pursues the first option. He thinks, we should just deny that what these creatures produce are tools. And then there are much more amazing discoveries concerning Caledonian crows who bend wire in order to lift, vessels out of water and so on. I mean, it's quite amazing. So anyway, Tallis pursues the first line. Animal use of tools, far from being an early or primitive form of human tool use, is not tool use at all, except in a metaphorical, anthropomorphizing sense. So we're anthropomorphizing, we're projecting our features onto animals when we say that these Caledonian crows, for instance, use or produce tools. But why? So, one observation is that animals do not use tools to produce tools. Okay? That's one reason that Tallis gives. The second reason, they do not store or develop tools. And their tool production merely amounts to modification rather than genuine manufacture. Okay, so now let's look at these reasons. Now I think 1, 2 and 3 are correct, except for storage. There's clear evidence for chimpanzees storing tools for later use. But of course, 1 to 3 are completely irrelevant to tool use and tool manufacture simpliciter. All that these observations suggest is that animals don't use tools to produce tools. They don't show that they don't produce tools. I mean, it's just a simple fallacy. And, as often is the case that, Tallis can't sustain his inflated conception of tool use, and he ever so often lapses into granting that animals use tools. So he says, for instance, that animals do use tools is not in doubt. Huh? Right? Well, that's a typical example of what J.L. Austin described. He diagnosed this as a general almost a déformation professionnelle of philosophers. There's the bit where they say it, and there's the bit where they take it back. Okay? So I think, taking it back is the smarter move. Of course these are tools, and, let's not just cheat. Okay, so what is the offshot of all this? Now I think we can ground that bipedalism and handiness are crucial driving forces in human evolution, but they do not constitute the anthropological difference, a defining feature of humans that sets us apart from all animals. So, just to make an obvious point, if we encounter primates which are physiologically and anatomically very close to us, including bipedalism and handiness, but that nevertheless lacked mental capacities, for instance, the capacities which sustain language or culture or cultural development, we wouldn't say that they are human. Yeah? Just having a dexterous hand or just being bipedal wouldn't qualify such a creature for being human. So it seems to me that, neither bipedalism nor handiness are really the distinguishing features. So, I think we are sort of driven back to the conclusion that these distinguishing features, although they go hand in hand with things like handiness, have something to do with our mental capacities. So, first conclusion, the question of what distinguishes us from animals, and the question of whether animals have mental capacities comparable to ours are closely connected. We can only talk about the question of whether we are special by looking at whether we have certain special mental capacities. Now, what about the connection between anthropological difference and animal welfare? So one entry on our list, I think it's number 2 if I remember correctly, shows that the ethical importance of animals is not confined to the topic that I've already mentioned, namely the topic of animal welfare. The ethical dimension of animals also has there's another side to it, and that is the topic of animal morality. Namely, do animals have moral beliefs, attitudes, sentiments, and practices? So that's why I've chosen this terminology. Animal welfare is the question of how we should treat animals. Animal morality is the question of whether animals have something like a moral sense. Now, I strongly incline towards the answer no, but I won't argue for that here. An affirmative answer has been given by, not just by thinkers like Montaigne, but also by contemporary scientists and philosophers. I think they're dead wrong, but that's a different matter. But I do want to point out that there is a connection between animal morality and animal welfare. They are connected insofar as having a moral status being an object of moral consideration may, and I stress may, depend on being a subject of moral consideration, i.e. may depend on being capable of showing moral consideration yourself. There is a position in moral philosophy, contractualism, and they insist that only creatures able to enter into some kind of agreement with us, or at least creatures capable of reciprocating our moral sentiments, can be fully fledged beneficiaries of moral consideration. So roughly speaking, if the animals aren't nice to us, there's no reason why we should be nice to them. That's if they can't agree with us and they can't sort of negotiate terms with us, then tough luck. But even if the anthropological difference does not consist in a possession of moral sense, the anthropological difference has clear implications for animal welfare. Among the mental features that we like to pride ourselves on, those that seem to ensure us of a higher moral status occupy a special role. I mean, free will, for instance, or self-consciousness, or a sense of past or future, those all, feature in the list of potential anthropological differences, because if that set us apart, that would also ensure us of a special moral status. So that takes me to the question of how animal minds and animal. So what's the conclusion here? There's a clear connection between the issue of what sets us apart from animals and the issue of animal welfare. Even if it's not the possession of moral sense that sets us apart, many of the features that have been suggested as constituting the animal-human difference have moral implications. But do they really? I mean, let's have another look at this. Let's have a look at the connection between animal minds and animal welfare. Now, the implications for the issue of animal welfare have fueled the interest in animal minds in the wider public sphere. This is very good news for people like me, because I'm a theoretical philosopher. I don't do moral philosophy, right? So most of the things I discuss don't interest anyone, right? But when I talk about animals, everyone thinks, oh, well, can we eat them? Should we keep them? And whatever and ever. And so that's immediately, raises my profile. So this is good news for people like me. But it also has certain drawbacks. It has led to what I call ideological interference. Many verdicts on animal minds are motivated neither by empirical evidence nor by philosophical argument, but simply by a desire to affirm or deny that animals are worthy of various degrees of moral and legal consideration. People first decide how we should treat animals, and then they listen to claims about animal minds which either support or contradict their views, and then they get terribly irate. It seems to me that's the wrong way to approach this. I think we should first decide, we should decide on the moral status of animals on the basis of their possession or lack of morally relevant properties, not on the basis of whether we like them or not. No. I mean, being cuddly may be a morally relevant property, but one needs an argument for that. So I reject this ideological interference of people who get terribly irate because they've been vegans since birth and regard anyone who eats animals as wicked. So I do think first decide on the morally relevant properties of animals, then decide on moral status. Having said that, there are two, respectable positions in recent philosophy that maintain that the morally relevant properties of animals are not tied as closely to their mental capacities as has traditionally been assumed. And I will discuss these, one very briefly and the other at greater length. So the connection between animal minds and animal welfare, these two positions would have it, is not as close as is often assumed. So the first position is a position called virtue ethics. Certain virtue ethicists hold something like the following. Our treatment of animals should not be guided by any sort of argument concerning the moral significance of the features possessed by or lacked by animals. Rather, it is a matter of our personal moral experience. In particular, it's a matter of the concern we have with leading a virtuous life. So we shouldn't wonder, what are animals like before deciding how to treat them, but rather, so how do we feel about animals? And if we pay attention to our moral experience, this will create an indescribable and sort of irresistible pull against cruelty towards animals. Quite irrespective of what animals are like. Now it seems to me that portrays our moral thinking and our moral practices as unduly egocentric. Egocentric is not the same as egoistic. It displays our moral lives as being more self-obsessed than it is, and certainly than it ought to be. Right? The question of whether how we should treat animals should be guided by animals and not by us. Now, maybe such a perspective can deliver the right verdicts on issues of animal welfare. Perhaps, the conclusions that you come up with, if you reflect on how you feel about, inflicting pain on animals, will be the right ones. But even if they are the right ones, they will be the right answers for the wrong reasons. The reason is not our moral experience, but whether or not we're doing something wicked to animals. So that doesn't seem to me to be acceptable. The second position is something which calls itself the vulnerability approach. So here is what these people say. Human beings should not exploit animals which are vulnerable, e.g. susceptible to harm or dependent on humans for their well-being or survival. And the proponents of this vulnerability approach contrast this approach with what they call the psychological approach of earlier animal rights activists, and people like Peter Singer, someone you may have heard of, according to which animals should be protected on account of their mental capacities. So Peter Singer, for instance, thinks there are certain mental capacities which are definitive of the idea of a person, and then he says animals have a lot of these, and therefore because they have these mental capacities, they should enjoy a strong degree of moral and legal protection. And this is something that the vulnerability approach rejects. So it's not what these creatures are capable of doing, it's not their mental capacities, it's their vulnerability which should lead us to take good care of them and not harm them. Now I think that that's a step forward from virtue ethics, because the vulnerability approach acknowledges at least that our treatment of animals should be guided by their properties, what animals are like, rather than by our psychological or moral foibles or requirements. Still, I think that there's something problematic. But, they think it's what animals are like that's important, but those properties are not the mental capacities of animals, but their vulnerabilities, the fact that they, that we can harm them. Now, what about the relation between capacities and vulnerabilities? I think I'll let you off on grounds of good behavior again. On this one. Yes, but I will say something about plants. So the idea is it's not the capacities of animals, it's their vulnerabilities. And in particular, it's not the mental capacities of animals, their mental properties, but their vulnerabilities. Now, I think in making this point, the vulnerability approach does shed light on something which is, I think, important when it comes to thinking of plants. So, because of having needs, plants like animals and humans have needs. They require water, carbon dioxide, etc., nutrients. I think plants, because they have needs, they are vulnerable in a non-metaphorical sense, in a sense that goes beyond the fact that my bike is vulnerable to, being damaged by rain. Yeah. For these needs, the needs of plants, like those of animals, can either be satisfied or frustrated. And it seems to me that because plants have needs, there is at least a case for holding that the needs of plants possess some moral weight, however slight it may be and however low its place in a hierarchy of moral demands. Yeah. I think it's wrong to destroy flowers, for instance, to tear them out, not just for aesthetic reasons, but also because, you are frustrating, to put it mildly, the needs of a living organism. So, to that extent, the vulnerability approach has a point with respect to our treatment of non-human life. But I don't think it, therefore, is right when it comes to animals. I think the vulnerability approach goes wrong in contrasting the morally pertinent features of animals with their capacities. I think the vulnerability approach, I'll get this right by the end of the lecture, is led astray by an unduly narrow understanding of notions like capacity, ability, and power. We talk about mental capacities, mental abilities, mental powers. And I think, they're led astray because they take the connotation of activity, a capacity or an ability, not to mention a power, is something active. I think they take that connotation of these notions too seriously. Their understanding of these terms, capacity, etc., is too literalistic. Being susceptible to external influences is also a capacity, at least insofar as being susceptible to the influences of the environment enables an organism to respond appropriately to its environment. So, although being sensitive to pain may be passive compared to being able to react, it's still a capacity, just like perception. Perception is clearly a mental capacity, and nevertheless, perception for the most part is passive. So you can have the capacity to be affected by the environment in a way which you then use to respond appropriately. Okay, so now I do think if we look at the connection between animal minds and capacities, we must conclude that the possession of psychological capacities such as sentience, the capacity to feel pain, the capacity to perceive, the capacity to have intentions, to have goals, and the capacity for thought, e.g. about the future, is both necessary and sufficient for the susceptibility to harm, which the vulnerability approach focuses on. It's necessary in that you can't be vulnerable unless you have things like sentience or intentions or thoughts. Plans, for instance. Your plans can be frustrated. That makes you vulnerable. Your goals can be frustrated. Pain can be inflicted on you. And these are all, ways in which you can be vulnerable. Without, these capacities, you can't be vulnerable. Conversely, these psychological or mental capacities are not just necessary for being vulnerable, they are also sufficient. If you have sentience, if you have goals, if you have thoughts, then you will be vulnerable to the sorts of frustrations that I just mentioned. So without sentience, no pain. Without intentions or goals, no frustrations. Without thoughts about the future, no fear of death. That's just an example of how, you become vulnerable by dint of your capacities. Net result, what kind of moral considerations various types of animals are worthy of depends on their mental capacities, widely conceived, rather than the other way around. Okay? So we must first look at the mental capacities of animals and then make up our minds about their moral status. The moral status of animals hinges in particular on whether animals are capable of experiencing pain, whether they are capable of acting intentionally, i.e. in pursuit of goals, whether they can have beliefs, desires, emotions, plans about the future, etc., etc. And I'm not going to tell you what I think, whether they are capable of experiencing pain. I will, of course they are. But anyway, there are people who deny this. Yeah. So, but that's not my aim. I'm not trying to decide this here in this talk. I'm just pointing out that it's these mental properties which should decide the moral status of animals. Okay, so what have I done so far? I've said there are three questions that human beings have felt the urgency of. Question of what sets us apart from animals, anthropological difference, the question of animal welfare, how should we treat animals, and the question of animal minds. Do they have mental capacities that we can in some way compare to ours? And I've tried to show that these three issues are strongly interconnected. More specifically, I have argued that both the issue of the anthropological difference, i.e. of what sets us apart from animals, and the issue of animal welfare really depends on the issue of animal minds. It's the stance we take on the mental capacities of animals that will determine whether we think there is a crucial dividing line between us and them, and it's the mental capacities that will decide how we should treat them. Okay, so now, why philosophy matters. So it transpires that both of these questions refer to, or our answers to them depend on, the question of animal minds. And just to repeat, the question of animal minds is, do some animals have minds or mental properties or mental powers comparable to ours? There's a more specific question which one might call the distribution question. What mental properties are possessed by what species of animals? Yeah. Which species of animals are capable of perception, of action, of goal-directed behavior, of thoughts about the past, memory, for instance? Well, certainly not all animals, right? But there is a good case, at least for some. So that's the distribution question. What is the distribution of mental capacities in the animal kingdom? Now, it seems to me that the answer to both of these questions, the question of animal minds and the distribution question, does of course depend partly on empirical findings. It does depend on facts about animals. Facts which we ascertain through observation in the field, like Jane Goodall's observation, or through ever more sophisticated experiments in the laboratory. But it doesn't just depend on these empirical findings. It depends also on how one understands heavily contested concepts, heavily contested ideas like that of a mind, as well as more specific mental concepts like the concept of a desire, the concept of a belief, the concept of a goal, the concept of agency. So it's how we understand these notions that plays just as much of a role in answering the question as the empirical findings. So, for instance, to show why empirical findings are important, and that's the easy part. If observations like those of Goodall show that some animals learn to use tools to solve novel problems in an adaptive and flexible manner, gosh, that's almost lyrical, this will favor the claim that these animals are intelligent or possess thought. Yeah. So that's an obvious point, the impact or the importance of empirical findings to the question of whether animals have mental capacities. But conversely, if, as the Aristotelian tradition has it, the concept of mind is equivalent to that of reason or to the intellect, this will favor the claim that most, if not all animals lack mental powers, everything else being equal. Or if being conscious of your environment, as some philosophers would have us believe, requires also being capable of self-consciousness. Yeah? You can only be conscious of your environment if you're also capable of yourself as being distinct from the environment. That again, will favor the claim that animals aren't even capable of consciousness. So how you draw the conceptual connections between these different notions matters to the answer you give to the question of whether animals have minds. That's really why philosophy matters, but I now just want to end by really making some very bold and possibly rash statements. Is there such a thing as the anthropological difference? I doubt it, but it's. I do think that even though there is no such thing as the anthropological difference, it seems to me obvious that there are fundamental mental differences separating us from animals. That seems to me to be common sense. I mean, I look around me, even this room, which is rather austere, or I look out on St. Giles, and do we have anything like this in the animal kingdom? Even the most sophisticated school of dolphins, or the cleverest Caledonian crow, or chimpanzees. I mean, get serious. Of course, there's an enormous gap separating human communities from animal communities. But it seems to me, and this is just a contention, I haven't argued for this at all, but concerning several of the morally relevant phenomena, like sensations, having an interest, having goals, having beliefs, being capable of action, being capable of choosing between options, a priori, non-empirical philosophical arguments denying that animals couldn't possess any of them are more often than not problematic. That is my view, but I've argued for that at great length. But anyway, here it's just an assertion. So these arguments which are supposed to show no animal can have any belief, no animal can have any interest, no animal can have can choose. Right? They're supposed to show this by reference to the concept of, let's say, agency or choice, etc. They all seem to me to be problematic. But why insist that the differences have to be categorical or categorical? Why to insist that the differences have to consist in, certain neat dichotomies? So, for instance, that the dichotomy or the distinction that we think, they merely perceive. We are rational, they are at most intelligent. We communicate by language, they only signal. Why I think that that the differences can be so neatly captured in these dualisms. So rather than say that only we can think or believe, or that only we can desire, or that only or want something, or that only we can communicate, isn't it enough to claim that we think and communicate about a lot more than animals, and in a lot more complex fashion? That may just be good enough. Because, for instance, if we can think about the future but the animals can't, so I can have beliefs about the distant future, but a cow can't, then, a cow can't fear being slaughtered in, a year's time. And that does constitute a mental, and, if this is so, I'm not claiming that it is, I believe it, but, if this is so, this constitutes a morally relevant difference. So I do think that, as concerns, for instance, the question of whether animals can believe things and whether animals can desire things, there is a difference, but it's not that animals can't desire anything. It's not that animals can't believe anything. It's rather a difference in quantity to begin with, but in this case it seems to me a difference in quality can arise out of a difference in quantity. The fact that we can believe, desire so much more in so much more complex fashions, that does set us apart from animals, and fundamentally apart from animals. So I think this is actually a case in which two philosophers I don't really care for that much in general, but Hegel and Marx were right. They thought that, a difference in quality may arise out of a difference in quantity. Thank you.